One of the most famous swords from history is without doubt the Roman sword, which comes in various forms, goes by various names. We're going to look at some of the types of Roman sword, where it came from, how it developed, the different types, and also a little bit of myth busting. Hi folks, my name is Matt Easton and I run the club Schola Gladiatoria HEMA club looking at historical combat. I'm also a former archaeologist and historian, so today we're going to be looking at the Roman sword, where it came from, how it developed, why it developed like that, how it was used to some extent, and what it became, where it went in the end. And there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of misconceptions about Roman swords. This video is very much inspired by a documentary I've just watched on History Hit called The Lost Lives of Pompeii. This video is actually sponsored by History Hit and I've got a special offer for you down below. More about that in a minute. So in this video we're going to be looking at the history of the Roman sword, where it came from, what it became, how it evolved, and where it went. And there are a couple of widespread misconceptions, I think. So the first is gladius, the word gladius. It seems to have been a word which was a loan word which came into Latin from Celtic languages, and in fact it survived in various other similar forms, related forms, in Welsh, for example, and other Celtic languages. So the word itself was a loan word into Latin, but it came in time to mean any type of sword. So a lot of people you'll find on the internet will make categorical black and white statements about the word gladius and it means a specific type of sword. No, the specific type of sword they're usually referring to is the Gladius Hispaniensis, which specifically means the Hispanic or Iberian Peninsula, what it became, so Spanish and Portuguese, the Spanish sword, okay, and because it was a Celto-Iberian culture, the word gladius, or the words Gladius Hispaniensis, particularly means a certain type of sword. But in time, the word gladius, because that was the predominant type of sword used by the Roman military, came to mean any type of sword. So it's a somewhat confusing word because it is both specific in one period and one sort of type of usage, and non-specific in another. Another really important fact that I want to make absolutely clear, and I have mentioned this in plenty of videos in the past, but this might be your first time watching me. The Roman sword was very much intended to be used with a shield. Okay, that's not to say that it wasn't sometimes used by itself, sometimes used with other objects. A cloak, for example, we know it's sometimes used in hunting. So it could be used by itself, it could be used with other things, but predominantly the Roman sword was intended to be used with Roman shields. And the type of shields in use is very important to the choice of sword and the developments of the sword. So although in this video we're going to be looking at the development of the sword specifically, you should bear in mind that the developments of the sword often go hand in hand with the developments of shields as well. And another widespread misconception is that Roman swords were made of iron. Well, in the modern world we class wrought iron, low carbon steel, medium carbon steel, high carbon steel. In the Roman world, the Roman sword was predominantly made with a steel blade. So a lot of people misunderstand the mass manufacture, industrial manufacture of steel as something from the 19th century, which of course is true, but steel has been around for as long as iron has been around. Steel is simply iron with a little bit of carbon in it, which enables you to make it much harder and enables you to quench it, for example, and make a hardened edge and temper it and things like this. So Roman swords were made of steel and they had extremely developed centres of manufacturing for sword blades in the Roman world. So absolutely Roman swords in the period we're going to be looking at were made of steel. So briefly, just before we delve into the main content of this video, I want to mention that this video is very kindly sponsored by History Hit, an absolutely awesome resource for learning more about history. And I've got a special link for you down below in the description. Imagine taking all of the history documentaries from TV that you love and squeezing them all into one place on demand. You can watch anywhere, traveling, sitting at home, in the bus, wherever you like. That's History Hit. Basically, if you imagine like Netflix, but it's all history. And you can enjoy that content on your TV, on your phone, on your tablet, anywhere on the move. And there are hundreds and hundreds of hours of things to consume on there. There's documentaries you can watch, there's podcasts you can listen to, and a whole bunch more. And it's got world famous experts on it, people like Dan Jones, Susanna Lipscomb, Mike Loades, Dan Snow himself, loads and loads of people on there. And in addition to the huge amount of content that's on there right now, they are constantly adding new content week in, week out. And amongst those are the podcasts that are being added all the time, including the award-winning Dan Snow's History Hit. And as mentioned, this video is actually inspired by Lost Lives of Pompeii, which I've just watched on History Hit. And in this, we get to see a lot of the environments where people were actually living their day-to-day lives. We look at some of those lives, some of the stories behind some of the people that lost their lives at Pompeii, and in some cases escaped. A lot of people escaped Pompeii as well. And of course, Pompeii, I visited when I was a kid, but it's constantly being expanded. We're learning new things day in, day out. Since I visited when I was a kid, for example, they found the gladiator school, including helmets and various other bits and pieces associated with gladiators that massively increased our corpus of material for what we have surviving from gladiatorial combat. So if you want to try out a History Hit for yourself, I've got a great offer here just for the viewers of this channel, and that is 50% off for the first 3 months using the code Schola Gladiatoria. You can also check out the link below. So that's 50% off for the first 3 months. For a few pounds a month, you get hundreds and hundreds of hours of history content. And thanks once again to History Hit for sponsoring this video and this channel. So let's get back to Roman swords. First of all, where did Roman swords come from and what were they using before the Gladius Hispaniensis, which is one of the most famous swords from history? I think most of you will agree. So quite fundamentally, they were using very similar swords to what had been used by the Etruscans and the Greeks in the period leading up to what we'd call now the Roman era. That is essentially the early Romans, up until the Punic Wars, were essentially using something similar to the xiphos, a form of Greek sword. Now, we have to ask, why did they make the switch to what we now know as the Gladius Hispaniensis, the Spanish Celto-Iberian sword? We don't know. Presumably there was something about it they particularly liked. Now, many people, when they talk about the adoption of the Gladius Hispaniensis, actually focus on the blade. But if we compare the Gladius Hispaniensis, certainly the early forms, with the xiphos, there isn't a huge amount of functional difference. They're both going to thrust about the same, they're both going to cut about the same, they're about the same kind of shape, and they've got a similar cross section. So actually, the shift from the earlier xiphos to the Gladius Hispaniensis is not very different in the blade. The most noticeable difference, the grip similar, the pommel similar, the most noticeable difference is in the guard. Now, there's many theories about why the Romans should prefer this form of guard over, for example, the cross guard we find on the Greek xiphos. In my opinion, some of these theories don't really hold much water, but there are a couple which I think are worth considering. So the first one, the lesser theory, I would say, the less convincing theory, is that having a type of guard that we find on the Gladius is more comfortable for thrusting. So if you are now predominantly using the sword as a thrusting weapon, this form of hand stop, if you think of it as a hand stop rather than a hand guard, so don't think of it as protecting you from the other person's weapon, think about protecting your hand from your own weapon. Having this kind of hand stop, a bit like we see on later medieval rondel daggers and even the disc guards that we find on things like poleaxes and alspies and things like this, makes a certain amount of sense if you're now predominantly stabbing. Now, were they predominantly stabbing? We'll talk more about that later in the video, cut versus stab, because that's something that, again, there's a bit of myth busting to do there around the Gladius. But anyway, so coming back to the handguard. So I would say one possible theory is that it's a more practical guard for people who are now predominantly stabbing. But here's the theory that I think holds the most water. The design of handguard is connected to the design of shield. Now, we know that the Greeks were using a large round shield that is attached to the arm, essentially strapped to the arm. That means that the shield is closer to the body, but it also means the shield is smaller, and therefore when you attack with the sword, it means the hand is going to extend out in front of the shield a lot of the time, in which case a a cross guard makes a certain amount of sense. So if we look at the xiphos, one of the things that's notable about it in the ancient world, whether it's the xiphos or incidentally the kopis, is they have hand guards on them. They have noticeable hand protection. The Roman sword doesn't really. But what are the Romans using? They're using the large oblong shield known as a scutum, which is held in the fist. So they're using a larger shield with a different shape, held in a different way, and they therefore don't need the handguard. You could look at this in two ways. They don't need the handguard of the the Xephos or the things like the falcata and the copius, so they don't need it. But on the other hand, they might not want it because having such a handguard might get caught up and snagged on your shield or on your clothing when you're drawing it from the right hand side and then using it close to your shield for thrusting. That guard would conflict with the edge of your shield. So I think the most convincing explanation for why they went from a Xephos-like sword to a Gladius Hispaniensis sword with a different handguard is to do with the shields. So once again, this emphasises we mustn't forget in the ancient world, particularly, in fact, in lots of periods of history, the design of a sword. To understand it, it's very important to look at what type of shield it was used with. In any case, this new model of sword was adopted into the Roman army by both the infantry and the cavalry, it seems, at least initially, as the Gladius Hispaniensis. Even in Greek, when it's described, it is described as an Iberian Macharis, so it's described as the Spanish sword. And this constant reference to it being a Spanish sword is found in various sources, most notably Polybius. There is also or has been some academic debate over when exactly this sword was introduced and why, which is what we're mostly looking at here. And it seems to be, some people argue it's during the First Punic War, some people during the Second Punic War, but essentially we're talking about 200 to 300 BC, essentially. And it seems to have been, therefore, during those wars, primarily inspired by Iberians fighting in the Carthaginian army. So essentially the Romans, as they would often do in later periods as well, adopted a weapon from the enemy. So what did these early forms look like? Well, the latest discoveries seem to suggest that the very earliest forms of Roman gladius were indeed very closely based on the Celtic Iberian swords that went before that. And they're quite distinctive and separate to Gallic swords of the period, which were generally longer and parallel edged. Now, the defining features of these swords in the early period are a long tapering point, a very slightly wasted or leaf-shaped shaped silhouette to the blade, and a very small handguard. In many ways, this blade shape is actually quite similar to earlier Bronze Age swords that went before, leaf-bladed swords, as we now know them as. They weren't known as that in the period. One of the features of this design is obviously you have a long, slender point, which is great for thrusting. And because of the shape of it getting wider and wider, it has a natural stopping point. So after about 6 or 8 inches of penetration, you're unlikely to continue to penetrate after that because the blade continues to get wider. But one of the other beauties of this design is because it gets wider, that also is around the center of percussion of the sword. So when you chop or cut with the sword, you don't chop with the tip, you usually cut or chop a bit further down from there, a few inches down, and this is where the blade is at its widest. And then it's wasted in where you don't need extra mass below that. So it's a great way of emphasizing the cut power of the sword and having a good thrusting point, but keeping the overall mass of the weapon as low as possible. But it should be reiterated that this is therefore a great cut and thrust design. It is not a specifically thrusting sword, it's a cut and thrust sword. Now, another feature that I think is worth mentioning of these early examples of Gladius Hispaniensis is the particular shape of the tang junction. So here I've got a book. The book is Roman Military Equipment by Bishop and Coulston. Very good book, I highly recommend. And you will see these Republican period gladius blades here that have been found archaeologically. Now, if we look at this area here, the junction between the blade and the tang. So the tang is the stalk that goes up inside the grip. You'll notice the tangs are fairly thin, but if you look at the angles of the shoulder of the blade, you can see that they curve upwards. Now, this is something very specific, and we find on a lot of other swords from other cultures and other periods a more horizontal line there, but you'll notice that these are diagonal upwards shoulders to the blade. Now, what's very interesting is that means that seats into the guard. So those angles actually go into channels formed in the top of the wooden guard, usually wooden, sometimes ivory or bone or other things, but usually wooden guard. And that means that the portion of the blade, essentially a portion of the blade, goes into the hilt. Now, the particular design of the Gladius Hispaniensis guard is very deep and can accommodate that shape. Why is that good? It makes them really strong. So a common point where swords break is the junction between the blade and the tang. So if you can embed that inside the guard, it essentially reinforces it and makes for a stronger construction. Though for full disclosure, I should point out that not all later gladii have this feature. If we look at this later Pompeii gladius here, you can see that actually has very squared shoulders. So just to be aware that whilst this is present on some gladius blades, it's not present on all of them. Now, coming back to the earlier blades, you will notice there's a tendency for some of the earlier blades to be somewhat longer and somewhat narrower than later gladius blades. So a lot of you will think of, when you think of a gladius, you'll think of the maybe kind of first century BC and AD version. The earlier ones do on the whole seem to have been somewhat narrower and sometimes longer. Now, this isn't a universal thing. In different areas we find different tendencies, and there were overlaps of types, and that's a really important point to make when we're talking about the development of the Roman sword. Sometimes a new type came along, like the Pompeii type later on, and it overlaps with the earlier types. But nevertheless, there is a general tendency for these earlier ones to be somewhat narrower in relation to their length, as opposed to the more iconic and famous later types, which look proportionately shorter and wider. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the methods of manufacture for Roman swords because it's incredibly complex and a very interesting topic and probably warrants its own video. But just briefly to say that one of the advantages of Roman sword making was, of course, Roman industry and resources. The fact that they had such developed industrial complexes meant that they were able to mass produce good quality swords, steel, and they were producing steel, blue Murray steel, to a very high standard, and in fact some of the best gladius blades show that they were pattern welded as well. So many of you will think of pattern welding as a later sort of Dark Ages way of manufacturing blades, but the Romans absolutely laid the foundations for pattern welded sword blades, and many of the pattern welded patterns that we see in Roman sword blades are incredibly complex and incredibly high quality. So many people, I think, are used to seeing a monosteel gladius blade reproduced, but you should think about some of these top quality gladii as being made of extremely intricately pattern welded steel of very high quality. But just to reiterate, not all of them were made pattern welded. Many of them were made in this way, but many of them were made out of what we could call mono steel or blue Murray steel. So some were made out of a single billet of steel and some were made in this more complex pattern welded structure. Now, the Gladius Hispaniensis seems to have evolved and developed into what we commonly call now, and it's a bit of a reenactorism, but the Mainz gladius. So this is because an example found in Mainz in Germany, which typifies this type, and this type of gladius was the most common in use up until about the middle of the 1st century AD. At which point we start to see a new type coming in, which is known as the Pompeii gladius. The Pompeii gladius being named after specifically 4 types that were found at Pompeii. Now, some books and websites you'll read will suggest that this was like a new model or a new pattern replacing a previous one, and to a certain extent maybe there was a degree of that, but you have to remember there was overlap. So while these 4 examples found, they're not dating after AD 79, found in Pompeii, of this new type, and we'll talk about the characteristics of these in a second. This new type, bear in mind that's Pompeii, and Pompeii is near to the heart of the Roman Empire at this point, whereas if we come to Britain, for example, we find things like the Fulham gladius. Now, what's that? That's sort of an intermediary type. So some people will break the types of gladius down into, there was the Mainz gladius, then there was the Fulham gladius, then there was the Pompeii gladius, and archaeology doesn't support that at all. What there seems to have been is a shift to a new type of gladius, and there was a period in which the Mainz and the Pompeii types overlapped, and during that period we find types that have characteristics of both, such as the Fulham example found in the river near Fulham Palace. So essentially the changes, so the characteristics here. So the Mainz gladius was really quite similar to the Gladius Hispaniensis. We could say it's somewhat shorter and somewhat broader. And it was the broadest type of Gladius Hispaniensis used. So the broadest type of gladius was the Mainz gladius. And the Mainz Gladius is usually characterized by a long tapered point and a slight waist to the blade. Different examples found archaeologically vary. Some are more wasted than others, some have a longer point than others, some are broader or narrower than others, or longer or shorter. So they're not regular, but they are similar, a similar grouping. The Pompeii Gladius, in comparison, which is far more numerous archaeologically and was used, as I say, from the middle of the 1st century onwards for the next couple of hundred years, is a type that it did lengthen as we go through the centuries to some degree, and we'll talk about the Spatha in a minute, which is another very popular type, an important type of Roman sword. But it's essentially characterized by parallel edges and a shorter, very triangular point. It should also be noted that the earlier Mainz Gladius has a more triangular point than the earlier Gladius Hispaniensis. So the Gladius Hispaniensis is a little bit more organic and curved in shape. The Mainz Gladius got more of a straight angled triangular point, and then the Fulham Gladius kind of carried on that trend and had a shorter, really triangular point and parallel edges. Now, some observations. Lots and lots of electronic and real ink has been spent on debating why did the Romans move from the Mainz Gladius to the Pompeii type Gladius. It could be economics. It could be that the Pompeii Gladius was cheaper, simpler and quicker to make. And I think that's true. I think anybody who's ever been involved with production of swords, and I am in my small way, would see that straight parallel edges and a shorter point are quicker and easier to mass manufacture than the earlier Mainz Gladius. It also uses less material in terms of mass. It tends to be a lighter weapon. So the Gladius Hispaniensis could be 900 or 1,000 grams in total mass, whereas the Mainz Gladius was down to about 800 and the Pompeii Gladius was down to about 700. So the Pompeii is generally shorter, generally narrower. It's just a lighter, smaller weapon. But there are some other features to notice. So thrusting versus cutting. Vegetius, Polybius, various people talk about the fact that Romans loved to thrust. But it's also very clear, especially from Polybius's accounts, that the Romans also liked to cut. And we know from gladiatorial use, and gladiators were a very important reference point for training Roman soldiers and understanding how they potentially trained. It's very clear that gladiators both cut and thrust with their swords, and it's also clear from descriptive accounts that Roman soldiers cut and thrust with their swords. Okay, even if they had a preference for the thrust, even if, just like Napoleon did in his wars, told his soldiers to prefer the thrust, not the cut, inevitably soldiers did still use them for cutting to some extent, and there were certain types of enemies where thrusting or cutting may have been more or less appropriate due to their armour or shields or the way they fought. So, is the Pompeii Gladius a more effective thrusting sword than the Mainz Gladius? I would say no. With one caveat. One thing we find in archaeological found examples of the Pompeii Gladius is some of them have reinforced points, somewhat akin to what we find in late medieval weapons, things like certain types of arming sword and longsword, rondel dagger, poleaxe and so on and so forth, whereby the point is specifically made as a square reinforced section. In fact, there's an example in the Royal Armouries in Leeds, which I've handled myself, which is exactly like this. It has a thickened, reinforced thrusting point. The only reason for doing that, really, is if you're expecting to thrust or stab people wearing protective clothing and or armour. Okay, so if you're stabbing people who are wearing mail shirts, like the Gauls did, for example, then having a reinforced square tip that's not going to break off in a mail link, but more like to burst a mail link and stab through, is advantageous. So I would argue that possibly the Pompeii Gladius is better adapted to fighting armoured opponents than the Mainz Gladius was. The Mainz Gladius is a thinner, broader blade with a thinner, more fragile tip, less appropriate for stabbing into armour and shields, it has to be said, whereas the Pompeii Gladius, I would say, is more robust, is tougher, certainly when stabbing's involved. There's one other thing which I haven't seen anyone else note, and that's about cutting. So most people would look at the Mainz Gladius and they'd look at the Pompeii Gladius and they would say, well, the Mainz Gladius is clearly more potent at cutting because it's a broader, thinner, flatter blade. And generally speaking, I think that's true. But don't only think about the deepness or power of the cut, think about the reach of the cut. Now, what's interesting is the taper of the Mainz Gladius brings the centre of percussion of the blade, in other words, the broadest part of the blade, quite far down the blade. Whereas with the Pompeii Gladius, despite the fact its overall length is shorter, its centre of percussion, having a shorter point, is actually further up. So you could argue that pound for pound or centimetre for centimetre, the Pompeii Gladius actually has more reach with a cut. Even though it can be a shorter weapon, the centre of percussion can be further up. I would add to that, and kind of supporting evidence, is that actually the Pompeii Gladius became longer with time, and we know there was a tendency for Roman swords to get longer and for the adoption of the Spatha into the infantry as well as the cavalry. So they were clearly starting to be more concerned about the reach of their weapons, both for thrusting and probably for cutting as well. So I would argue that the Pompeii Gladius is not only cheaper and easier and quicker to make, but it also has a more robust point for stabbing into armour and resisting materials, and possibly is more catered towards a longer reaching cut than the Mainz Gladius is. So where does the Spatha come into this? Well, that's a good question, you may ask. It's not crystal clear, and lots of people debate about this. So there are some references which suggest that the Spatha came into Roman use as early as, I think, the Second Punic War against the Carthaginians. So it's possible that it did have some pre-Age of Christ period use. However, for the most part, it appears that after, or sort of after the 1st century BC, we start to see the Spatha probably being used by cavalry because it's a longer bladed weapon. Now, where did it come from? Many people have said that it was inspired by the wars with the Germans, the German tribes. However, current research seems to suggest that it's actually, yet again, more of a Celtic influence, a bit like the Gladius Hispaniensis itself and mail armour, for example, hamata, glorica hamata, and certain types of Gallic helmet that were brought into the Roman army as well. So there's various equipment which is brought into the Roman military machine, which seems to be from the Celtic tribes, the Gauls, the Iberian Celts, perhaps even the Britons to an extent. So it seems that this is true of the Spatha as well. So we could argue for a Germanic origin or influence. We could argue for a Gallic and Iberian influence. It's not really clear and the jury's out. But based on what I've read in this book and others that I've got and various websites, I think the weight of evidence at the moment suggests that the Spatha was a longer bladed blade brought in primarily for cavalry and inspired by Celtic peoples that the Romans were fighting against, and the Carthaginians as well, perhaps. But the important thing to note is that the cavalry had the Spatha, but contrary to what lots of people think of the infantry as having the Gladius and the cavalry having the Spatha, in fact, it seems that the Spatha became increasingly common in the infantry from a relatively early period, and there's even some suggestion that they started adopting the use of the Spatha perhaps in the 2nd or 3rd century in the infantry for use by the front rank to give them extra reach. This is a very interesting point. Regardless of whether that's the fact or not, what we do know is that certainly by the 3rd and 4th century, the Romans had basically abandoned the use of the scutum. So again, we come back to shields. Okay. Now, when you bring in a smaller flatter, in most cases, shield, as opposed to the old heavy rectangular curved scutum, this inevitably changes the type of sword you're going to prefer to use. And bear in mind, not only has your equipment changed, you're now wearing a mail shirt and a different type of helmet and a smaller, more mobile shield, but so are your opponents. Your opponent's equipment has changed as well. So for a whole combination of reasons, it's evident that by the 3rd and 4th centuries, and probably starting in the 2nd century, the Romans started to adopt the longer bladed Spatha into the infantry, such that by the 3rd and 4th centuries, it was absolutely the most common form of sword. But it is confused by the fact that it's also clear that the old Pompeii Gladius got longer. So what we've got is sort of two different routes to get to the same end goal. Essentially, you end up with Roman infantry having something akin to a medieval arming sword used with their new types of shields instead of the old scutum. And this is a cut and thrust sword as well. We only have to look at the cross sections of this blade to see that. But the origin of these longer infantry swords can be from two different sources. I think it's partly from the Celtic-inspired cavalry swords that were being used, and partly from the elongation and evolution of the Pompeii type gladius. Some of these Spatha have flattened diamond section blades, like a Pompeii gladius. Some of them have a flat blade, and if we look at etymologically, if we look at the language of the word Spatha, it seems to become a Greek loanword that refers to something that is wide and flat. And what's interesting is when we look at, for example, the Needham bog-fine swords, and we look at certain other swords of that kind of 3rd century period, we find that these longer bladed Roman swords come in a variety of cross sections. Some of them are flattened diamond, some of them are flat sectioned lenticular, multi-fullered, sometimes with 2 or 3 fullers in the blade. So there's actually a whole variety, and the Spatha therefore is a very diverse group of swords that may, in period, and we lack source material for this, but may sometimes be the evolution of Pompeii Gladii, or they might sometimes be the cavalry swords with a Celtic inspiration behind them. Now, during this period of the 2nd and 3rd century, a lot of hilts of these swords maintained their same basic form of a essentially round pommel, a sort of semi-spherical guard, and an usually octagonal section, sometimes round or oval, sometimes even square section grip, usually ribbed for gripping. However, there are exceptions to that. There are some more ornate types of hilt. One type that we see is an eagle pommeled style hilt that we see on certain carvings. And equally, here's an example. This is another type we sometimes see, a ring pommelled sword, and they come with longer or shorter, wider or narrower blades, a variety of blades, but these ring pommelled swords are found archaeologically and sometimes found on statues as well. So there were diverse types of hilts being experimented with in this period as well. But something I find fascinating is even going in as late as the 3rd century, if we look at the Vimos finds and various others, despite the fact we've got various experiments with blades, multi-fullered blades, flat lenticular blades, diamond section blades, a broad fuller type blade like we'd find on later type 10 sort of Viking era swords. The hilts, although there are some experimentations with hilts, the hilts often maintain this characteristic sort of gladius form, essentially, that we first see all the way back, in the 1st, 2nd century BC, in fact, of a essentially spherical pommel and a hemispherical guard with a little grip in the middle. So even though we find other types of hilts starting to come about at this point, we still got swords in the 3rd century which don't look very different to swords from the 1st century BC. So to wrap up, where did these swords go? Well, ultimately we've seen that the blades tended to get longer, although short-bladed swords were still in use all the way up to sort of the 5th century. But as we come into what's commonly known, certainly in the West, as the migration era, essentially we see Roman swords have gone in two directions by this point. In the West, they become migration era swords, and essentially these are predominantly inspired by the Spatha, we could say. But you have to bear in mind, if you look at some of the late periods, so like 4th century Roman swords, for example, the one found in Lyon, clearly that has a relationship with earlier gladii, but if you look at the scabbard fittings and even some aspects of the hilt, it looks like later migration era swords. So there is some kind of missing link in there as well. So in the West, it essentially becomes the migration era swords, and as we know, there were certain, in the early period, there were certain blade cross sections which are very, very close, basically identical to certain forms of late Roman Spatha that were being used, even if the hilt designs changed somewhat under the sort of Germanic, the Frankish, Anglo-Saxon and Germanic kingdoms. And then in the East, you've got to bear in mind that the Roman Empire continued in the Byzantium, and Greek swords very much, there was a continuous development of the Roman sword from the Spatha into the Greek swords that were being used in this period. And bear in mind, in the age of Charlemagne, there was a lot of exchange between the Byzantium and the Empire of the Franks, for example. So there would have been some exchange of military technology ideas in that period as well. So the Roman sword didn't stop, it didn't go away, it just evolved into the migration era and dark age, if you want to call it that, weapons that we see in both Western Europe and down in the Byzantine Empire and everywhere that was influenced by those two sort of cultural spheres. I hope this video has been it's a relatively big topic to try and cover in one video, and maybe I'll do some deeper dives in future videos. But I hope it's been enjoyable. If you've got specific aspects of anything I've covered here you'd like me to do deep dives into, then obviously post below. And finally, once again, I'd like to say thank you very much to History Hit for sponsoring this video. Remember that link below if you want to check out History Hit. It's a great offer using the code Schola Gladiatoria, and it's 50% off for your first 3 months. Few pounds a month, few dollars a month. You get tons of history content. There's some really great stuff on there. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.